Welcome to the podcast of the Public Education Foundation.
I'm Zhan Okuda-Lim, Resident Fellow with the Leadership Institute of Nevada. I'm here today with Kriste Dragon, CEO and co-founder of Citizens of the World Charter School and a member of our Leadership Institute faculty. Kriste, it's great to have you here today on our podcast.
Thank you so much. It's a delight to be here.
So tell us a little bit more about your story in terms of founding Citizens of the World and a little bit more of your background on your own educational journey and experiences and how that led to the work you're doing today.
Sure. So as a co-founder, my personal story is very much part of the founding of our organization. So I tend to tell those stories as one. I was raised in the American South, in Atlanta, Georgia, in the 70s. I'm from a mixed race family, and both of my parents grew up relatively poor. My mother never went on to college, but my father actually leveraged academic and educational opportunities, which changed the trajectory of his life relative to his siblings, for example. So growing up at our breakfast table, at our dinner table, we talked a lot about issues of educational opportunity, race, income, culture, and it wasn't until much later that I found out that that was rather unique, perhaps, in the circle of community that we lived within at the time. So I actually progressed through public education, graduated from a public high school in 12th grade, went on to University of Alabama, which is where my father attended school. We didn't do college tours. That wasn't really part of our culture as a family.
Roll Tide.
Roll Tide. That is one wonderful benefit of being a graduate of Alabama. But I look back on things like the fact that I filled out my application in pencil, that no one reviewed my application. And frankly, I think as a student who was not particularly strong in high school from an academic standpoint, I am grateful that I was admitted to college and grateful that my parents encouraged me to attend. I did very well in college, however, and I think some of that was probably related to my engagement in the material, and I ended up doing well enough to receive a scholarship to law school. It was in law school that I started to really discover my passions. So I was a juvenile public defender. We had a third-year practice act that allowed us to try cases under the supervision of a practicing attorney. And the inequity of our world really came to life for me in juvenile court. I saw many of the inequities that we see in schools playing out in the lives of children who were court involved. And the impact and the consequence was severe and serious, given that many of these kids were facing time in detention centers. A couple of my clients were presented shackled to the judge. One of my clients was presented shackled at the wrist and the ankle, and he was under 10 years old.
Oh my goodness.
It shaped a lot of the way I thought about opportunity. And I started asking myself, okay, where could I have been in the life of a child to ensure that the opportunities that were given to my father are given to all children, meaning educational opportunities. Mm-hmm. And school felt like the logical answer. You know, while there were many things that my clients or the children I served had in common, one of them was that they had been through the same school pattern or school cluster. And so I started spending time in schools, which led me to accept a teaching position in Los Angeles after graduating from law school. And then I just never left education. I fell in love with my families, with my students. I taught a little bit at the college level and have been involved in education-related organizations ever since.
Tell us a little bit more about Citizens of the World and the values that guide the curriculum and the work that you and the educators in your organization use as part of your curriculum and teaching.
Absolutely. You know, because I had my first child, I'm a mom. I have 3 kids. They are now 20, 15, and 10. But that first child, my now 20-year-old, was born my first year teaching. And I am very grateful for the fact that I entered the profession at the same time that I entered parenthood. And I'm grateful because it called out many things that had I not aligned within my life and my professional practice, might have been an integrity flag, or might have presented as integrity flags. So I'll make that very concrete. The schools I was working in at the time were very focused on language arts and math only. Now, I very much value measured progress in language arts and math, so I'm not saying that I don't. But what was interesting is that in looking for a preschool for my own child, I also valued many other things. And some of those things were not quite measurable. Like, was it the kind of environment that would develop her curiosity? Would she develop a strong sense of confidence and identity? Would she have opportunity to fail and stand up again and figure out what she was passionate about and try to make a difference? And all of these things that I thought it'd be very unfortunate if I was holding a different, more narrow set of standards for someone else's child, and then a very broad, in some cases not as measurable, set of standards for my child. So I actually stumbled into school creation and school founding in an effort to be part of a school that I would send my own children to.
And as part of your time with our teacher leaders and the Teacher Leader Academy, you're working with our participants looking at what it means to build an authentic and an inclusive school culture with staff, with colleagues, with members of the school community, and also with families, with the students, with the broader community beyond the walls of that school. Take us a little bit through what conversations you and our teacher leaders have been having as you're talking about moving from this idea of building a school and community culture to actually doing the work on the ground day to day.
I think a lot of people think about community engagement and they want to go directly to action steps. So what are the 5 things I can do to engage my community? And we've found it valuable to think about community engagement at a meaningful level as co-creating with a community. And if you hold that as what you're actually after is co-creation, then you have no choice but to focus on building trust, building understanding, and building connection. And we actually think the pace of change that you will be able to make with your community will depend very much on the level of trust, connection, and understanding that you've built. And so what we're talking about in the academy itself is we're taking our teacher leaders through 3 different paradigms. Self, which we talk about as the skills that you sort of possess internally and have to work on. So things like your own identity, your perception of your identity, your tendency toward bias, those are internal. We talk about a second paradigm that we call together. Together might deal with my listening skills when I'm speaking with you. It might deal with my ability to empathize in a situation that you have. My ability to stay curious as you are sharing an opinion I disagree with. And then the third and final paradigm we call world. So how do we engage within the context of a system like a school and think about the skills that must be built in order to meaningfully co-create within that paradigm?
So how might that look for, say, a classroom teacher who at the beginning of a school year with a whole new set of students, or perhaps several sections of students if they're teaching multiple classes? What might that look like for that teacher to engage in these different yet all interrelated paradigms of co-creation and understanding the self in the context of a broader community? What might that look like?
Well, if you buy that the paradigm is worth investigating, then the good news is that there is no sequential pattern. So you don't have to do self-mastery before you talk about together, before you talk about systems. So on a parallel track, some of the things that might be happening in the classroom, teachers might be spending time in PD or in their own reflection thinking about themselves as leaders. And I don't think there's anyone out there that would disagree with the importance of that. At least no one's ever said to me that that's not important. Yet when I look at the time that we dedicate to standard professional development, there's usually very little dedicated towards self-reflection, one's identity development, or even one's identity as a leader, which we know matters in the classroom. So that's kind of the self paradigm. In the together paradigm, we spend some time in this session of the Teacher Leader Academy talking about things like stereotype threat, looking at research, and answering questions about how that research applies to the classroom setting and to settings that involve the families of our students and the caretakers. And then in the world setting, we talk about policies. We look at some case studies, 2 different case studies, both within the context of a single state at a similar point in time. And we talk about the systems level choices and engagement processes that yield quite different results within those case studies.
And it's interesting to think about this idea of co-creation from the standpoint of starting fresh. Say if it's a new school year and you're meeting new students, or if there's a new school that's just opening and you're the principal of that school and you get to establish that framework from the ground up. What about situations where there might be tension already in a school setting, whether perhaps in your experiences with Citizens of the World in, say, opening up a new school, or working in a school where there might be issues with the school culture? How might that look maybe a little bit differently in working to improve on a school culture and build that community where there might be tensions or issues currently at play?
I think that's a very fair question, and one that many of the teachers actually have asked during this session. So the place where we try to focus attention is, what do you actually have the ability to influence? And if your influence is limited to your students, your cluster of faculty members, and your families, the families of your students, then we think that's a great place to start. And we really suggest that we not underestimate the value of a strong pocket of community engagement, meaningful co-collaboration, and how contagious that can become. Because maybe people are telling themselves a story about how communities don't want to engage, and you provide the counterpoint. Maybe people don't know how to engage the community, and you provide a roadmap. Or maybe you just start then talking differently about the power of this engagement and the way that impacts your students' performance and the feel of your classroom, and that is enough to breed curiosity in others.
Funny you mentioned story, and this has come up during your time with the teacher leaders here. There's been discussion about the narratives and the stories that we hear from others about the people around us, and how a teacher might accept those stories at face value, or come to create their own story based on what is heard, right? And these can be stories that we tell ourselves, or we hear about the families in our school or the students in our school, and how those can breed into the biases and the prejudices that we might hold against fellow teachers, students, the families in our community. What does it mean, and how could it look to challenge those sorts of stories, the stories that are told, the stories we tell ourselves about the students that we're serving, the families we're working with? What does it take to do that level of both self-reflection and also mobilizing with colleagues to take a different viewpoint at a community level?
I think that's a very important question for this moment in time.
Indeed.
There seems to be a great amount of disconnection, polarization. I might use stronger words if I really thought about it, in the broader setting in which we live. And we know that trickles into our schools. So I think step one is to realize we do tell ourselves stories. We tell ourselves stories about our own existence and ability, and we tell each other stories about the existence and ability of others. And we choose whether we listen to those stories. So there are some pretty standard, maybe pause moments we can take, and some of those are skill-based. I'll give you one that we use in our schools. We can constantly ask ourselves, what else could be true? What else could be going on? And maybe that's enough to slow ourselves down. But we find, even without those little behavior reminders, even just talking about the fact that a single story is dangerous, that it, to use the words of speakers far greater than I am, it flattens an identity. It can remove dignity. if we come to really accept that, maybe then we're more aware of when we are engaging in and entertaining a single story, and maybe then we can suspend that story long enough to see the whole of the human, the whole of the family, or the whole of the school community.
And that's such an important point. Within the context of addressing systemic issues at a school level or a district level or some other system level, at the same time, there's also the importance of understanding oneself, right? And what role one might be playing in the broader issues that you're seeing in a school setting or in a system level setting. And I appreciate you sharing that point because moving forward, whether it's for teacher leaders, for school leaders, for system level leaders, having a better knowledge of oneself and where one stands in the broader system is important to addressing some of the broader inequities that we see in the education setting. So Kriste, thank you so much for spending time with us on our podcast and also for working with the teacher leaders and the Teacher Leader Academy on some of these very deep yet very necessary and important questions. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be here.